I want to show you guys a picture. Now, what you're looking at here is an artist's depiction of what the Titanic could have looked like if Titanic had hit the iceberg head on. Yeah, that's pretty extreme, huh? Anyway, that right there is what we're going to be talking about today. Should Titanic have hit the iceberg head on? Now, it's a very interesting question, and it's a question that a lot of people have discussed at great lengths. Would Titanic have been better off hitting the iceberg straight on? Now, I asked you guys this question on Instagram and on YouTube, but before we look at that, I just want to remind you guys to please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about Titanic and disasters, so if you're into that, you're probably going to like the channel. Okay, so let's look at what I asked you guys. So this really is an issue of two different questions. The first question is, would Titanic have stayed afloat in a head-on collision scenario with the iceberg? And the second question is, should Titanic have hit the iceberg head on? Now on YouTube, when I asked you guys, would Titanic have stayed afloat in a head-on collision? It was sort of a mixed bag. I gave you guys 4 different options, and it looks like the majority of you said it depends on many factors. And I agree. There are many, many different factors at play. It's hard to say yes or no on this one. Now on YouTube, we have a very interesting comment by Dwight. Yes, it would survive the collision, but the impact would injure or kill a lot of passengers because it was going around 21 knots towards a colossal iceberg. It's like ramming a car into an object. Totally agree. Thank you for the comment. Now on Instagram, I got an insane amount of responses because it wasn't a poll. I let you guys say your thoughts. So let's take a look at what some of you guys are saying. We see absolutely not. Yes. Yes, she should have, but there would have been loss of life. Yes, it would. It was designed to stay afloat with the first 4 compartments breached, not 5. I've heard yes, maybe. I would assume no. And then we have this one. It's not plausible because no one on the bridge would have thought to ram it head on. So as I mentioned previously, this is a topic that has been debated for years and years and years. And as you can see, even within our Instagram and YouTube Titanic community, there are many differing opinions. So thank you guys for responding to those questions. If you guys want to participate in some other cool polls like this for my YouTube videos, make sure you follow me on Instagram, titanicguy.com, and make sure you subscribe. Okay, so obviously we have a lot of opinions. I'm going to tell you what I think a little bit later in the video, but first I think we really need to break down the 2 questions that I talked about earlier. Number 1 is, would Titanic have even stayed afloat in a head-on collision? So why do people even say this? So the reasoning behind this comment is, let's take a look at why Titanic even sank in the first place. If we look at what happened the night of the sinking, basically the Titanic spotted the iceberg and the order was given to go hard to starboard. So in that time, that meant to turn left. So First Officer Murdoch ordered a left turn. We know that unfortunately there was just not enough time. And Titanic ended up grazing the iceberg on her starboard side. And because of Titanic's speed and the incredible impact, it caused a lot of damage along the side of the ship. And essentially it opened up 5 compartments and a bit into the 6th compartment. As we know, Titanic could have stayed afloat with up to 4 compartments in certain configurations, but having 6 compartments damaged was essentially the deathly blow, and Titanic had no way of surviving, right? Now, in a head-on collision scenario, what a lot of people say, and the reasoning behind that is that, okay, if Titanic smashes straight into the iceberg head first, then obviously fewer compartments would be breached, right? If you have a head-on collision, then the first maybe 2 or 3 compartments would have been damaged. Water would have stayed contained in those areas. And in theory, Titanic could have stayed afloat. That's the reasoning behind that. That's why people even bring up the question. Now, in that scenario, we also have to consider many, many different things. Number 1, there would be catastrophic damage to the structure of the ship. Think about it. If you have a ship that is traveling at 21 knots and it rams straight into a wall of ice, you would have had an insane amount of damage to the actual structure. So who's to say that a lot of the other compartments would not have buckled and that the ship itself would have crumbled? There would have been catastrophic damage. It would have been unthinkable in the middle of the ocean. So Even if Titanic had hit the iceberg head on, it's not even guaranteed that only 2 or 3 compartments would have been breached. It's entirely possible that even more compartments would have been breached and that Titanic could have sank even quicker. The other thing to consider is there 100% would have been a significant amount of death, because if you look at who was at the bow of the ship, that is where all of the third-class single men would have been berthed. That's also where a lot of the crew had their sleeping quarters. So upon impact in a head-on collision scenario, hundreds of people would have instantly lost their lives. They would have been crushed. They would have been crumpled right there. So yeah, that's not good. And we can actually look at some of the damage done in some other ships. For example, let's take a look at the RMS Olympic, Titanic's sister ship. We know that famously, the Olympic had an accident with the HMS Hawk, where essentially the HMS Hawk rammed into the Olympic head first. And now if we look at the picture of the aftermath of that incident, the HMS Hawk got murked. It got destroyed at the front. The bow is all crumpled in. So that is a significant amount of damage. Imagine that on the Titanic with people berthed right where that damage would have taken place. It would have been crazy. It would have been catastrophic. We can also take a look at the disaster of the Andrea Doria with the collision of the Stockholm and the Andrea Doria. If we look at the pictures of the aftermath, it's very similar to what we saw with the HMS Hawk. Significant amount of damage, crumpling, and in that particular case, there was loss of life as a result of that collision. So we know for sure that in a Titanic head-on collision, there would have been significant loss of life. Now, it's important to notice that in both of those scenarios, the Stockholm and the HMS Hawk, they did in fact survive the impact. So in those cases, they didn't sink as a result of a head-on collision, which is why I think it's a fair case to make to imagine that if the Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, she may have had significant damage, but she probably could have stayed afloat. It's entirely possible, I would say. So my verdict on this particular question, could Titanic have stayed afloat in a head-on collision with the iceberg? Yeah, I think it's possible. We'll never really know because that's not what transpired. I would say it is possible. However, that being said, I want to turn it over to the second question that we looked at earlier. Should Titanic have smashed into the iceberg head-on? Now, this one is a little bit more interesting in my opinion, because, well, we already determined that I think it is possible. Would this scenario have even been probable? And that's where I say, no, I don't think this is a probable scenario whatsoever. And I'm going to tell you why.
There's truth, but no logic.
Let's go back to the night of the sinking. First Officer William Murdoch is in command of the Titanic. Now, if we look at Murdoch, this dude was an experienced sailor. First Officer Murdoch came from a family of all sailors. He had been doing this since he was a young boy. He had years and years of experience, and he had been working with the White Star Line since 1900. So he knew what he was doing. He was very comfortable, and he also knew how to handle the Titanic because he had worked on the Olympic. He knew the Olympic class ships. Now let's put ourselves in First Officer Murdoch's shoes for a second. So, night of April 14th, it's 11:39. And then we hear the 3 bells.
Fucking me!
We know that from the time that Murdoch saw the iceberg and Frederick Fleet saw the iceberg, there were approximately, 37 seconds, 40 seconds, that number's disputed, but it was a very short amount of time, not even a minute. So First Officer Murdoch had to decide within that split second what to do, and he had the fate of 2,200 people in his hands. In my opinion, an experienced officer like Murdoch would not have ever considered smashing a brand new ship like the Titanic into an iceberg. Think about it. That sounds like ridiculous to even think about. This is the most famous ship in the world. It's brand new. There are a lot of very famous and powerful, wealthy people on this ship. Do you think that a very experienced sailor like Murdoch would willingly ram that ship into the iceberg in the middle of the ocean? There is absolutely no way. Now, we need to remember that hindsight is 2020, guys. We today have the benefit of knowing what happened. We have the benefit of hindsight, right? So it's very easy for us to create a scenario and we say, oh, let's look at a cost-benefit analysis. We can compare the two outcomes, right? The ship sinks, 1,500 people die, or possibly head-on collision and a few hundred people die. We can make that analysis because we obviously have hindsight. So obviously in that scenario, most people would pick, okay, yeah, head-on collision makes sense. A few hundred deaths is better than 1,500 deaths. But in that split second, First Officer Murdoch didn't have the benefit of hindsight. He had to make a decision based on his experience and what he thought would be the best course of action to save his ship. And that, of course, was try to avoid the massive block of ice in front of your ship, right? There's absolutely no scenario where Murdoch would have given the order to go straight into the iceberg. That's why, for me personally, there's no question. Could Titanic have stayed afloat? Yeah, it's possible. But is it probable? Never. Not in a million years. But of course, that's just my opinion. As you saw earlier, there are many differing opinions, which is awesome. We love having a conversation. So what do you guys think? Do you think that this is even a plausible scenario? Could Titanic have stayed afloat? Should Murdoch have smashed into the iceberg? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I hope you guys learned something new today and that I gave you something to think about. If you want to find out what happened to Titanic's lifeboats, click this video here. And if you want to see me debunk some crazy Titanic TikTok conspiracy theories, click this video here. Thanks so much for watching the video, guys. The link to all the merch is, of course, in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.